Have you ever felt the pain of voting for the lesser of two evils instead of a candidate that actually represented your interests but had no chance of winning? Do you find it frustrating when others won't vote for a better candidate because they feel it would be throwing their vote away? How about politicians who don't even bother representing your interests because they know you will feel no choice but to vote for them after having so effectively demonized their opponent? These problems all stem from not having a system of sound voting rights. Such a system would allow voters to sincerely and completely express their preferences without having to worry about the tactics of how sincere votes can backfire into working against the voter. Not only does such a system of sound voting rights exist, I will demonstrate it to you right now. For clarity, I have limited this demonstration to the very small scale of only 10 eligible voters, but this sound voting rights system works at any scale with only minor changes to the details. Have a look at this ballot. Here's your ballot confirmation. It is randomly generated, known only by you, and used by you alone for this election only. We will need this number later. For now, just remember it starts with AE and ends with 93. In the Edit Ranking section, you can express your preferences completely instead of being limited to only your first choice. In this case, your first place vote is for minor improvements, your second place vote is for status quo, and your third place vote is for radical changes. So to be precise about what you are expressing here in this example, you are saying you prefer minor improvements over status quo, you prefer minor improvements over radical changes, and finally, you prefer status quo over radical changes. If you are only able to express your first choice, the information that you prefer status quo over radical changes would be thrown away, compromising your voting rights because this part of your preference could not be taken into account when the votes are tallied. Now let's look at the public tally of this election. But before we go there, remember your ballot confirmation starts with AE and ends with 93. Now that we are on the tally page, let's find your ballot confirmation. The only one that starts with AE and ends with 93 is here, the third one down. To make sure anyone can verify for themselves that their vote was recorded accurately, every single ballot is available to the public. However, since your ballot confirmation is private, no one knows which one is yours. In this way, you can personally verify that your ballot was recorded accurately without sacrificing the secrecy of your ballot. As you can see, just like the ballot you cast, the first place is minor improvements, the second place is status quo, and the third place is radical changes. The results are calculated by comparing every possible pairing of candidates. From there, we can find a total ordering of the candidates. With 3 candidates, as we have here, there are 3 possible pairings: minor improvements versus status quo, minor improvements versus radical changes, and status quo versus radical changes. Starting with minor improvements versus status quo, let's see how each of the 10 voters in this example chose. The first 3 votes put minor improvements at first place and status quo at second place, so we add 3 votes to minor improvements. The next 3 votes put status quo at first place and minor improvements at second place, so we add 3 votes to status quo. So far, we have a 3-3 tie. Finally, the last 4 votes rank minor improvements at second place and status quo at third place, so we add these final 4 votes to minor improvements, making the final score 7-3 in favor of minor improvements. Notice that in these last 4 votes, neither minor improvements nor status quo were in the first place position, so this information would have been lost if we were only allowed to specify our first place preference. From here, we know that minor improvements must be ranked higher than status quo, as 7 people prefer minor improvements while only 3 people prefer status quo. Our second pairing is minor improvements versus radical changes. Let's count the votes for this pairing. The first 3 votes rank minor improvements at first place and radical changes at third place, so we add 3 votes to minor improvements, 3-0 so far. The next 3 votes rank minor improvements at second place and radical changes at third place, so we add 3 more votes to minor improvements, 6-0 so far. Also remember again that since neither of these were a first place vote, this information would have been lost if we were only allowed to specify our first choice. Finally, the last 4 votes rank radical changes at first place and minor improvements at second place, so we add 4 votes to radical changes, bringing the total to 6-4, favoring minor improvements. From here, we know that minor improvements must be ranked higher than radical changes, as 6 people prefer minor improvements, while only 4 people prefer radical changes. Our last pairing is status quo versus radical changes, and we compute this pairing the same way we did with the first two pairings. The first three votes rank status quo at second place and radical changes at third place, so we add 3 votes to status quo, 3-0 so far. The next 3 votes rank status quo at first place and radical changes at third place, so we add 3 more votes to status quo, 6-0 so far. Finally, the last 4 votes rank radical changes at first place and status quo at third place, so we add 4 votes to radical changes, bringing the total to 6-4 in favor of status quo. From here, we know that status quo must be ranked higher than radical changes. Now that we have compared each candidate to each other candidate, we are ready to figure out the total ordering. Since minor improvements defeated status quo 7-3 and also defeated radical changes 6-4, we know minor improvements must be in the first place. Since status quo defeated radical changes 6-4, we know that status quo must be in second place. Finally, since radical changes did not defeat any other candidate, radical changes goes into third and last place. As obvious as it is that minor improvements is the best choice and radical changes is the worst choice given these votes, the exact opposite would have happened if we only counted the highest first place votes instead of comparing the candidates in pairs. Although 6 out of 10 voters preferred either minor improvements or status quo over radical changes, their first place votes were split into 3 and 3 instead of 6, allowing radical changes to have the higher number at 4. It is important to note that radical changes did not have the majority. They only happened to have a larger minority because their opposition's votes were split so evenly. The voters for status quo would have been punished for voting honestly. They would have been better off surrendering their votes to minor improvements in order to prevent radical changes from winning. Only valuing first place votes makes it so that candidates don't need to listen to their voters. All they have to do is frighten people into voting for them by demonizing their strongest opponent. Only valuing first place votes also motivates candidates to reject good ideas of their opponents, as similar candidates risk having their voter base split, giving the advantage to less appealing, yet more unique, candidates. However, if we have a sound voting system that takes the entirety of voter preferences into account, candidates have to listen to the people or risk being defeated by a third-party candidate. As all of the ballots are public by ballot confirmation rather than voter identification, you can tally the votes yourself to ensure they were counted correctly while still maintaining the secrecy of your ballot. At the bottom of this example, there is a list of everyone who voted, so that if you did not vote, your vote cannot be stolen without your name showing up in this list. Votes cannot be diluted either because we can demonstrate that the number of voters matches the number of ballots. This example relies on having a small list of known individuals, but there is no reason, in principle or in practice, that this can't be scaled to large countries by changing the details of how voter privacy and vote auditability are balanced. The primary thing you have to get right is to make sure the number of registered voters matches the number of ballot confirmations, and that the ballot confirmations are shuffled before being mailed out so that only the voter knows their ballot confirmation. There are also ways to deal with unusual situations, such as ending up with a circular preference, that I will not go over here. So what do I mean by the phrase sound voting rights? I am specifically referring to these 7 voting rights, and all 7 of these voting rights are secured by the sound voting rights system that I have just demonstrated. You have the right to personally verify that your vote was cast or not according to your choice. You have the right to personally verify that your vote is accurate. You have the right to personally verify that your vote was tallied correctly. You have the right to be free from coercion in how you vote. This right is secured by implementing secret ballot. Limited only by the constraints necessarily imposed by secret ballot, you have the right to be maximally assured that your vote was not diluted by illegitimate votes. You have the right to have your complete preferences taken into account by ranking all choices in your preferred order. You have the right to vote honestly without having to choose the lesser of 2 evils for fear your honest vote will work against you. This right is secured by comparing the candidates in pairs. Having sound voting rights both improves the way people vote and the way politicians behave. No longer do you have to vote for the lesser of 2 evils. You can vote for the best candidate and still be assured that your preference between the remaining candidates will be counted. No longer is it practical for politicians to demonize their primary opponent. Once voters are free to express their entire preference, all opponents must be accounted for. No longer can politicians afford to ignore third-party candidates. Once voters are empowered to express their preferences among all candidates, these politicians may suddenly discover it is them that turned out to be the third-party candidate. The ability to implement sound voting rights exists. They can be implemented incrementally and at any scale. The only thing stopping us from having this is the knowledge that it is an option and the will to demand that our leaders implement sound voting rights.